My beloved child, don't skip. Listen carefully, because this fictional story begins on an ordinary evening when silence has lasted much longer than either heart expected. Stay until the very end, because what unfolds next is not a prediction about your life or someone else's. It is a fictional story about love, misunderstanding, courage, and the life-changing difference between assumptions and honest conversations. Sometimes people do surprising things. Not because they have stopped caring, but because they no longer know what silence truly means. The evening sky slowly turned shades of gold, crimson, and deep blue as the town settled into another peaceful night. Streetlights flickered on one by one, cafes welcomed their final customers, and families gathered together after another busy day. Yet in one quiet apartment, someone sat alone staring at a phone that had remained silent for far too many weeks. They had opened old conversations countless times, reread familiar words, and wondered whether reaching out would bring healing or simply reopen old wounds. Every passing day had become another argument between hope and fear. Hope whispered, "Maybe there is still something worth saving." Fear answered, "Silence means everything has already ended." Neither voice ever completely disappeared. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional heart of this fictional story begins here. One rainy evening, after another long day of pretending everything was fine, they quietly stood before the hallway mirror and asked themselves a question they had avoided for months. How much longer will I allow fear to make decisions for me? The room remained silent. Yet something inside finally answered. No longer. At that very moment, they made what everyone around them would later describe as a crazy decision. Not something reckless. Not something harmful. Something courageous. They decided to stop allowing silence to write the ending of a story that had never truly received an honest conversation. They canceled unnecessary plans. They postponed several meetings. They packed a small overnight bag. Not because they expected a perfect ending, but because they no longer wanted regret to become a permanent companion. In this fictional story, what they experienced as God's guidance was not telling them what another person felt. It was the quiet encouragement to live according to honesty rather than fear. They realized they could never control another person's response, but they could choose whether they lived truthfully. During the journey, memories quietly accompanied every mile. The first shared smile. Long conversations that made difficult days easier. Quiet encouragement during seasons of disappointment. Gentle patience shown when life felt overwhelming. Looking back, they realized those moments had never truly disappeared. Only communication had. Meanwhile, somewhere else within this fictional story, another heart quietly carried an almost identical burden. Every evening they wondered, did they stop caring? Did I wait too long? Would reaching out only make things worse? Without knowing it, both hearts had spent months asking nearly the same questions while allowing silence to answer them incorrectly. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now reveals one of its deepest truths. Sometimes the craziest thing a person can do is not chasing another human being. Sometimes it is finally choosing honesty after months of hiding behind fear. Pride often calls that decision foolish. Courage calls it freedom. As the journey continued, they stopped briefly beside a peaceful roadside chapel. Sitting quietly beneath an old tree, they whispered a simple prayer. If this conversation is meant only to bring peace, let peace be enough. If it becomes the beginning of something new, let it be built upon honesty instead of assumptions. Whatever happens, help me leave fear behind today. Those words brought unexpected calm. They no longer felt driven by desperation. Only by sincerity. The road ahead remained uncertain. Yet for the first time in many months, uncertainty no longer frightened them. Because they had finally stopped allowing silence to become stronger than truth. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because the next chapter of this fictional journey will reveal what happened when the person finally arrived at the place where one heartfelt conversation had the power to replace months of misunderstanding, proving that sometimes the bravest journey is not traveling across many miles, but walking beyond fear with honesty, humility, compassion, and hope. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, the journey that seemed impossible is about to reach its most meaningful moment. Listen carefully, because sometimes the greatest distance between two hearts is not measured by roads, cities, or passing years. It is measured by one conversation that both people are afraid to begin. This is not a prediction about your life or anyone else's. It is a fictional story about courage, healing, forgiveness, and discovering that truth often arrives quietly after fear has spoken for far too long. As the evening slowly settled across the quiet town, the person finally arrived at the familiar place where so many meaningful memories had quietly begun years before. The small riverside cafe remained almost unchanged. Warm lights glowed through its windows. Soft music drifted into the cool evening air. Nearby, the old wooden bridge still stretched across the peaceful river where countless sunsets had once been admired together. Everything looked familiar, yet both hearts had changed more than either could fully explain. For several long moments, they simply stood outside, watching people come and go. Doubt briefly returned. What if I'm too late? What if silence has already written the ending? Before fear could speak again, they quietly remembered the words written inside the notebook. Before believing fear, always give truth the chance to speak. Taking one slow breath, they gently opened the cafe door. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional heart of this fictional story begins here. Sitting quietly near the window was the very person they had hoped to see. Neither immediately stood. Neither rushed across the room. For a few peaceful seconds they simply looked at one another, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with quiet recognition. The first smile appeared almost unnoticed. Then came the second. Without either person planning it, both quietly laughed. Not because anything seemed funny, but because the tension that had lived between them for so many months suddenly began disappearing. After sitting together, neither tried to explain everything at once. Instead, one gently asked, "How have you really been?" It was the first time either had asked that question without expecting a quick answer. The conversation unfolded slowly. They spoke about difficult seasons. About mistakes. About fears they had hidden even from themselves. About nights spent wondering whether silence had already ended everything. Finally, one quietly admitted, I almost never came today. The other smiled gently. I almost stopped hoping you would. Silence followed once more. But this silence no longer carried uncertainty. It carried understanding. Looking toward the peaceful river outside the window, one softly whispered, "I thought you had forgotten me." The answer came almost immediately. I never forgot. I simply stopped believing I still mattered. Those words remained suspended between them. Neither interrupted. Neither defended the past. Instead, they simply allowed honesty to finish speaking. In this fictional story, what they experienced as God's guidance was never about forcing two people together or revealing exactly what tomorrow would bring. It was the gentle reminder that healing begins whenever people choose humility instead of pride, listening instead of assuming, and truth instead of fear. Every honest sentence quietly rebuilt trust that silence had slowly weakened. Hours passed almost unnoticed. The cafe gradually emptied. Employees began quietly arranging chairs. Outside, stars reflected gently upon the calm river. Neither wanted to rush the evening. Not because they feared goodbye, but because they had finally discovered how peaceful genuine conversation could feel. Before leaving, one reached into the overnight bag they had carried throughout the journey. Inside remained the small notebook. Carefully opening it, they removed the old unfinished letter. Looking at it one final time, they smiled. Then quietly folded it and placed it back inside. I don't need to send this anymore. The other looked curiously. Why? Because tonight. I finally said everything my heart had been carrying. The answer came with another peaceful smile. And tonight. I finally listened. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now reveals one of its deepest truths. Sometimes what appears to be a reckless decision becomes the wisest one a person has ever made. Not because it guarantees the ending they hoped for, but because it frees them from living beneath unanswered questions. Honest conversations may not erase yesterday, but they allow tomorrow to begin without fear carrying yesterday's burdens. As they quietly walked together beneath the peaceful night sky, neither spoke about forever. Neither hurried toward promises. They simply agreed on one beautiful beginning. From this day forward, we will never allow silence to decide what only honesty should decide. Both smiled. And for the first time in many seasons, the journey ahead no longer felt frightening. It felt hopeful. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because the final chapter of this fictional journey will reveal how one ordinary family gathering quietly becomes the place where everyone discovers that the crazy decision was never traveling across the miles. It was finally choosing truth over fear, leading to a future built upon trust, compassion, gratitude, and enduring peace. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, the decision that once seemed crazy begins revealing why courage often changes far more than one person's life. Listen carefully, because sometimes the most meaningful miracles happen after honest conversations, not before them. This is not a prediction about your life or anyone else's. It is a fictional story about healing, trust, forgiveness, and discovering that relationships grow strongest when fear no longer controls every decision. The morning after their heartfelt conversation arrived quietly. Golden sunlight stretched across the rooftops while birds welcomed another ordinary day. Yet neither heart viewed the morning as ordinary anymore. They had not solved every question overnight. They had not erased every difficult memory. What they had gained was something much stronger than certainty. They had gained understanding. For the first time in many months, both woke without replaying old misunderstandings. Instead of wondering what the other person might be thinking, they knew they could simply ask. Instead of assuming silence meant rejection, they had learned that silence sometimes hides fear more than indifference. That lesson quietly became one of the greatest gifts either had ever received. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional heart of this fictional story begins here. Later that afternoon, an unexpected phone call arrived. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't mysterious. It came from one of their family members. "We're having dinner tonight. It would mean a lot if you came." For a brief moment, nervousness returned. Meeting one another had been one thing. Meeting both families together felt completely different. Yet something inside quietly reminded them that honesty had already carried them this far. Perhaps it could carry them one step further. As evening approached, the home filled with warm laughter and the comforting aroma of homemade food. Children played happily through the garden while older relatives shared stories beneath glowing lanterns. There were no grand introductions because everyone already knew one another in simple ways. Yet tonight felt different. Not because anyone expected dramatic announcements, but because everyone quietly sensed that something peaceful had changed. During dinner, conversations flowed naturally. People laughed, shared memories, discussed ordinary life. No one hurried uncomfortable questions. No one forced important conversations. Instead, everyone simply enjoyed being together. Then, after the meal had ended, one elderly family member slowly stood holding a warm cup of tea. The room gradually became quiet. Looking kindly toward everyone gathered around the table, they softly said, "Many people believe love is proven by dramatic moments." They gently smiled. "I've lived long enough to discover something different. Real love is proven by ordinary days. By people who stay kind when misunderstandings appear. By people who apologize before pride becomes comfortable. By people who choose conversation before silence. By people who continue growing instead of blaming." Every person quietly reflected upon those words. The person who had once believed silence had ended everything lowered their eyes for a moment. Then softly whispered, "I almost let fear convince me to walk away forever." The other gently smiled. "So did I." Neither blamed yesterday. Because both had already learned from it. In this fictional story, what they experienced as God's guidance was never about guaranteeing a particular outcome. It was the gentle reminder that healthy relationships are built by people who continue choosing honesty after disappointment, forgiveness after mistakes, humility after success, and compassion even during uncertainty. Every ordinary decision quietly becomes another stone in the foundation of lasting trust. After dinner, everyone stepped outside beneath the peaceful evening sky. Thousands of stars shimmered above while cool breezes moved gently through the old oak trees surrounding the home. Children chased fireflies across the lawn while grandparents quietly smiled watching generations laugh together. Standing beneath the stars, one softly said, "Do you know what the craziest decision really was?" The other smiled. "No. It wasn't coming here. It wasn't traveling across town. It wasn't choosing to have one difficult conversation." They looked peacefully toward the sky. The craziest decision would have been allowing fear to steal another year of our lives. Neither spoke for several moments. Because neither needed to. Truth had already spoken. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now reveals one of its deepest truths. Sometimes courage looks ordinary. It looks like making one phone call. Offering one apology. Listening without interrupting. Speaking kindly after months of silence. Those simple decisions rarely attract attention, yet they quietly transform lives in ways dramatic moments often cannot. In this story, what they experienced as God's guidance gently reminded them that peace grows wherever honesty is faithfully practiced. As the evening slowly came to an end, every family member hugged one another before returning home. There were no extraordinary signs in the sky. No impossible miracles. Only peaceful hearts. Sometimes that is miracle enough. Walking home beneath the moonlight, both quietly realized something beautiful. The future no longer needed to be perfect. It only needed to be truthful. Because truth had already accomplished what fear never could. It had brought peace. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because the final chapter of this fictional journey will reveal how years later, one unexpected moment reminds everyone that the greatest blessing was never the courageous journey itself. It was the life of kindness, honesty, gratitude, and enduring hope that quietly grew because two hearts finally chose truth over silence. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, the journey that began with one courageous decision is about to reveal something neither heart expected. Listen carefully, because sometimes people believe the hardest step is showing up. In truth, the hardest step is remaining honest after you finally arrive. This is not a prediction about your life or anyone else's. It is a fictional story about healing, faith, forgiveness, and discovering that trust is rebuilt through gentle conversations rather than dramatic moments. The evening had almost faded into night by the time they finally reached the quiet place where so many memories had once been created. The old riverside park looked almost exactly as it always had. The wooden benches still overlooked the calm water. Soft lights reflected across the gentle current. The familiar oak trees stood silently beneath the stars, unchanged by the passing seasons. Yet the people returning there had changed more than either of them could fully understand. They paused before taking another step. Not because they wanted to turn back, but because they understood that one conversation could quietly reshape everything that followed. For several peaceful moments, they simply stood watching the river flow. It reminded them of time itself. Always moving. Never returning. Yet always offering another beginning. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional heart of this fictional story begins here. As they slowly continued walking, they noticed someone standing near the old bridge looking out across the water. Neither called the other's name. Neither rushed forward. There was no dramatic reunion. Only two quiet smiles filled with relief. One finally spoke. "I almost didn't come." The other gently nodded. "I know. I almost didn't either." Both softly laughed. Not because the journey had been easy, but because they suddenly realized how close fear had come to convincing both of them to remain silent forever. After a few quiet moments, one carefully asked, "Can I tell you something honestly?" The answer came immediately. "Please." Taking a slow breath, they quietly admitted, "I thought your silence meant you had stopped caring." The other looked toward the peaceful river before softly answering, "I believed exactly the same thing about yours." Those few words carried months of misunderstanding within them. Neither interrupted. Neither tried to defend the past. Instead, they chose something far more valuable. They listened. As the evening continued, they spoke openly about everything they had quietly carried alone. The fears they had hidden. The regrets they wished they had shared sooner. The ordinary moments they had continued remembering long after they believed those memories no longer mattered. Every honest sentence removed another invisible wall that fear had quietly built. In this fictional story, what they experienced as God's guidance was never about revealing another person's future with certainty. It was the quiet encouragement to replace assumptions with conversation, pride with humility, and silence with kindness. They realized that genuine peace begins whenever hearts become willing to understand before judging. As the night grew quieter, they reached the center of the old bridge where countless stars reflected upon the calm water below. One gently smiled. "I packed a bag because I thought I needed to chase an answer." The other softly replied, "And instead, you found a conversation." Both smiled again. Because they understood something neither had realized before. The answer they had been searching for had never been hidden in dramatic signs. It had always been waiting inside one honest conversation. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now reveals one of its greatest truths. Sometimes people believe they are running toward another person when they finally choose courage. Yet often they are really running toward becoming the person fear never allowed them to be. In this fictional story, what they experienced as God's guidance reminded them that every healthy relationship begins with two people who choose truth even when uncertainty remains. Before leaving that evening, neither promised perfection. Neither spoke about forever. Instead, they made one quiet agreement. No more allowing silence to decide what honesty deserves to answer. The other gently nodded. One conversation at a time. Those simple words felt stronger than any dramatic promise. As they slowly walked home beneath the peaceful night sky, both realized they no longer carried the same burden. Not because every question had disappeared, but because fear no longer carried the loudest voice. Hope quietly did. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because the next chapter of this fictional journey will reveal how one unexpected family gathering becomes the place where everyone quietly recognizes that the greatest, crazy decision was never making the journey, it was refusing to let fear write the ending of a story that truth had not yet finished telling. My beloved child, don't skip these final words, because every chapter of this fictional story has been leading to this peaceful and unforgettable ending. Listen carefully, because what began with silence, misunderstanding, and hidden emotions was never truly a story about losing someone. It became a story about two people learning that fear can speak loudly, but truth spoken with kindness will always endure longer. This is not a prediction about your life or your future. It is a fictional story about healing, faith, forgiveness, and discovering that the greatest miracles often begin with one honest conversation. Several months passed after that quiet evening on the old bridge. Life continued much as it always had. The sun still rose over the hills each morning. Families gathered around dinner tables. Children laughed in the parks. Rain still fell on quiet afternoons, and stars still filled the sky every evening. Yet something had changed forever within both hearts. They no longer allowed silence to become the author of their story. Whenever confusion appeared, they talked. Whenever misunderstandings surfaced, they listened before assuming. Whenever difficult days arrived, they chose patience instead of distance. One beautiful autumn afternoon, the entire town gathered for its annual harvest festival. The streets were decorated with warm lanterns, colorful flowers, and handmade banners created by local children. Music echoed gently through the square while neighbors greeted one another with joyful smiles. Long wooden tables overflowed with homemade meals, fresh bread, fruit, and warm tea. It was the kind of ordinary celebration that quietly becomes unforgettable because of the people who share it together. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because this is the emotional heart of the entire fictional story. As the evening drew closer to sunset, one elderly woman who had quietly observed both of them throughout the years slowly stood before the gathered families. She smiled warmly before speaking. I have watched many people spend years searching for love, she said gently. They believed they needed to find the perfect person. She paused. But the happiest people I have ever known discovered something much more valuable. The crowd became completely silent. They first became people who were honest. People who forgave. People who listened. People who chose kindness even after disappointment. She looked lovingly toward the two friends standing quietly beside one another. The greatest miracle was never that they found each other. The greatest miracle was that they refused to let fear have the final word. No applause followed immediately. Only peaceful silence. The kind of silence filled with understanding. One quietly turned toward the other and softly said, I used to think losing you would be the hardest thing I'd ever experience. The other smiled gently. I think losing ourselves to fear would have been much harder. Both quietly laughed. Not because life had become perfect, but because they had finally learned what truly mattered. In this fictional story, what they experienced as God's guidance was never about controlling another person's choices or guaranteeing a particular future. It was the quiet invitation to become people whose lives reflected humility, compassion, honesty, gratitude, and enduring hope. Those qualities quietly transformed every relationship they touched. As the evening continued, families shared stories beneath countless stars. Children danced beneath glowing lanterns while older generations smiled watching new memories quietly being created. Looking around, both realized something beautiful. The journey had never only changed them. It had quietly encouraged everyone around them to speak more kindly, forgive more quickly, listen more patiently, and appreciate one another more deeply. Sometimes the greatest influence is never announced. It is simply lived. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now shares its final truth. Love is not sustained by perfect timing. It is sustained by truthful conversations. By promises kept during ordinary days. By forgiveness offered before resentment grows. By choosing compassion after misunderstanding. By remembering that every meaningful relationship deserves honesty before assumptions. Those quiet choices become stronger than fear could ever be. As the festival slowly came to an end, both families gathered together for one final photograph beneath the old oak tree where so much of their journey had quietly begun. Looking toward the camera, nobody smiled because life had become free from challenges. They smiled because they had learned they would never need to face those challenges alone. The old notebook that once carried unsent letters now rested peacefully on a bookshelf back home. Its final page contained only one sentence. The greatest blessing was never finding the right moment, it was becoming people who never again allowed fear to silence love. My beloved child, remember these closing words as this fictional journey comes to its peaceful conclusion. Never allow fear to speak louder than kindness. Never postpone forgiveness until tomorrow. Never assume silence always tells the truth. Speak honestly while there is still time. Listen patiently before reaching conclusions. Treasure the people who bring peace into your life, and continue becoming someone whose presence leaves others feeling valued, respected, and understood. And so, as the first light of another beautiful sunrise slowly filled the valley with shades of gold, blue, and crimson, the two quietly walked forward beside the people they loved most. Their story ended not with dramatic promises or extraordinary miracles, but with something far more lasting: hearts transformed by truth, lives strengthened by compassion, families united by understanding, and hope renewed with every new morning.